Hello and welcome to Copenhagen Fashion Week. My name is Ane Lynge-Jorlén and I head Designers Nest, an incubator of Nordic fashion talents. I have the pleasure of moderating this talk, New Gen and the Media, with emerging designer Amalie Roege Hove and fashion features editor at ID, Mahoro Seward. Amalie, your very first show is tomorrow, and it's so exciting. We're all rooting for you and clapping in our hands and hoping it will be an amazing experience for you. But I bet there are 1,000 things on your to-do list right now, so thanks very much for being here.
Of course.
How are you feeling? Butterflies?
Very nervous, but also it's just an overwhelming experience. I'm really looking forward to show all the things we've been working so hard on, and I think right now it's just like tying all the ends, and then I'm really looking forward for tomorrow.
Yeah, good luck with it.
Thank you.
So, since graduating in 2018 from the Royal Academy with a degree in textile design, you have worked for Mark Tan and Cecilie Bateson, and in 2019 you launched your eponymous label, specialised in knitwear, and you're now stocked at Essence and Farfetch and quite a few Japanese retailers as well. Quite a successful journey in only a couple of years, in my view.
Thank you.
When I look at your work, I find that you have a sort of a material-based starting point for your design, or at least a sense that the material regulates the design. I'm curious how you made the transition from textile design to fashion design.
I've always been interested in the body and, when you dress and how things affect each other. And I think for me it was kind of it just kind of happened because I think every time I worked with the textiles, I very much imagined it like on the body and how it would affect the body and, when you move. So for me, it was more an interest in the way the textiles and body work together. So it wasn't so much of a choice. It was more like my way of working that, I would have a hard time feeling like a textile was finished. It was just like a flat. I really felt like it needed some sort of dimension to change and also to create that room and space between, the textile and the body. So I think for me, it was quite natural, in my process.
And that transition, embracing construction, was natural for you as well?
Yeah, I think earlier on I didn't really know that much about textiles. So for me, fashion was like just sewing clothes and stuff like this. So I actually kind of started doing that. But then when I figured out, okay, I actually have the chance to make the textile myself, I was like, that's insane. Then I could do so much in like one work. So yeah.
Mahoro, ID is such a legendary style magazine that's championed emerging designers since the 1980s. No pressure. Before joining ID, you worked at One Granary, a platform that also supports emerging designers and fashion graduates. Fashion media is so intrinsic to the whole fashion system, and supporting or getting exposure is crucial to emerging designers. I'm interested in sort of how do you, as an editor and writer for ID, do you see yourself as having an active role in discovering and supporting talents?
I guess to a certain degree, yes, but I would say that I see my role as more sort of consolidating and mediating a designer's vision to an audience. I think that historically, like online fashion media has kind of played a really crucial role in helping designers to get exposure, but I think that so many designers are actually quite good at doing that themselves through their own social media platforms. I think that where I come in is kind of finding a way to sort of flesh out and but give designers space to sort of like expand upon what their worlds mean through text in ways that they can't necessarily do on image-based platforms like Instagram or increasingly TikTok. So I think that's how I'd see my sort of role there, I suppose.
You said that young designers are so, good at, finding ways to get exposure themselves. I guess you mean also via SoMe and other channels now. But, print still holds this sort of kind of symbolic, sacred value.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Everyone just likes physical magazine, don't they? And I think it sort of really heightens the experience of engaging with something. When you're holding a magazine, you're looking at these gorgeous printed images, and it's a really slowed format of engagement. And you were talking about the tactility of your work. I think that sort of applies to a print object. You're really engaging with this sort of there's something very ephemeral to that I don't think you kind of get when you're just like scrolling on your phone, for example.
The luxury of actually,
Yeah.
trees have been knocked down to create this
So
magazine.
luxurious. Yeah.
So just coming back to Amalie's work, in my view, I think there's been this material turn in fashion with a sort of a new focus on materiality and craft. There's also been a rebirth of domestic hand knitting, which has been a big thing. Amalie, your work is obviously super focused on knitwear as your primary technique, and I wouldn't say material, but yeah. So what is it that makes knitwear so great in your point of view?
I mean, for me, it's very much the process of, when you make knitwear, you can kind of take into consideration, you have a shape, you have like a surface, you have all these things coming together. So you're not just making like a flat piece of fabric. You can from the start say, okay, I really want to start in this corner of the body, and then I want, a certain texture, or I want a certain like shape. And then one thing is, when you have it on the machine, and then when you take it off, it just completely changes. And I think it's just super relevant if you're able to do so much work, on one machine. Because for me, it's really just kind of eliminating all the processes afterwards, as much as I can make in like one work, but also because you have all these things affecting each other, like, the tension, the technique, the way you just tweak each little needle on the machine. So I think in that sense, it's really appealing to me.
You told me prior that you have this, that you're now exploring ways to design with unbroken nylon thread, so that the knits are made in uninterrupted yarn. And I find that so fascinating, and I really love this methodological approach that you have. What's the benefit of designing with unbroken threads?
I think there's one part of it, of course, in it really much affects the shape if you constantly are aware of, okay, I have to just work with this one thread and I can't break it. So you constantly have to find these solutions around the body in a way, like, okay, how can I move this way? Can I move this way? And I just think, for me, it's also just setting like some challenges with the machine, because I've been knitting for so long. So it's really just, the more I found out, the more I'm like, okay, now I just really want to push the boundaries even further. And that's also what I'm trying to do with my factories, to kind of like inspire them to work in a different way, because I think it's really important. And knitwear have so much potential. So.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Mahoro, in your point of view, what do you think have led to this increased interest in the work of the hand, materiality and tactility?
I mean, are we talking kind of in the wake of the pandemic, or, well, I personally think it has a lot to do with the fact that when you're looking at images of clothes on a screen, like, you want something that makes you want to touch it, that evokes that feeling of clothes through an image. And so I think that, yeah, that naturally translates to an interest in handwork, and also just people becoming more aware of the way that things are made. And like, when you kind of have that feeling of the hand, and there is a sort of like a fingerprint almost of its process there, there's almost like a reassurance of the thought that's been invested into that piece. And I think it's far more easy to forge an emotional connection with that piece, which then ties into kind of conversations around, yeah, a more emotional side to the sustainability conversation as well. Yeah. So I think it's a kind of mixture of a new consciousness and also just people being bored with looking at images on a screen and wanting something that feels just really great and sort of evokes that through sight. Yeah.
Yeah, I also see this sort of the new interest in craft is also an interest and awareness of history, how we've designed in the past. I think that's very much coming back as well.
Yeah.
Amalie, I also feel that your work, in a sense, leaves room for diverse body types, because you work in material that is stretchy and adjustable. And I'm curious how you approach the body when you design as a 3D form, and if you consciously consider body diversity when you work.
I mean, I really do. I think it's both me being super inspired when I see, customers around the world like using our clothes, and but for me, it's also the process, on the machine. I, as much as possible, try to get like people down in the studio, so when I have samples and these things, that I can just constantly try them on the body, because for me, it changes so much. And I think, the piece just changed so much depending on the body wearing it. And I have like customers that are like, what is this style? I don't understand. But it's because, it just changes so much. And also with the transparency, you have the skin, but then you also have, depending on what you put underneath it. So I think for me, it's extremely important doing something that, can fit all, but also something that people feel like inspired to use in a different way, due to their body in a way. So I think it's important, but also for me it's kind of like inspiration for my work, because when I get someone down the studio and they try it, I always feel like, okay, we could use it in a completely new way. And I also like make a lot of styles that you can take, back and forth on the body, and then you can kind of like you can use that style for even more personalize it in a way.
So it's more versatile.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mahoro, in the past few years, as a result, of course, of Me Too and Black Lives Matter and the whole issue of fashion's environmental impact, I do think that we've seen fashion becoming more self-critical and aware of its blind spots. And this is something I feel that emerging designers have, and niche and style magazines have done forever. They've been conscious about this for many years. How, as a writer and an editor, how does this criticality inform your work and the topics and people that you write about?
Well, I think it's front and center, but no more than it should be for anyone who lives in the world today. But I mean, I would say that it definitely informs who I'm thinking of writing about, the topics I'm thinking of writing about. There are instances where I'll definitely write about designers or fashion creatives who are making sort of well thought out comments, well, who are basically commenting on these things with gravity. But I also don't think that that is necessarily the sole sort of component in when it comes to what I think I'm going to write about. So it's definitely important, but I also don't think it should necessarily be that designers should be kind of forcing themselves to kind of comment on these things. They should just be things they're educating themselves on, as should be the case for everyone. But I also don't think it's fair to kind of like force designers into a situation where they feel that they need to in order to gain exposure. Like, I don't think that all black designers should be forced to be talking about Black Lives Matter. Like, there are other things that we should be given space to talk about. But I do think there is a responsibility of anyone working in fashion today to be conscious of what those blind spots are and, yeah, I guess working in their own way to kind of remedy them, or, yeah.
And certainly ID has been sort of a voice, giving a voice to the underground of fashion for many years. And is that something that you think still sort of informs the whole editorial tone of the magazine today?
Definitely. I do think that things are changing, and I think that the way that people consume the work of young designers is changing quite drastically over the last 2 years. So I think it definitely still informs our editorial direction. It's just more a case of thinking of how we can bring these conversations to our audience in the most efficient way. And now I think it's like, maybe it's best to do something on social media where there's an audience that's far more receptive to the kind of fab visuals that you're going to be like putting out than they would be in the form of like an 800-word profile. So I think it's an interesting time in fashion media, specifically when it comes to covering young designers and thinking about what is the best way to sort of bring this work to the right audience. And that isn't always a sort of like written format. Yeah.
Getting exposure can be tricky for emerging designers sort of trying to get a footing in the industry. And what is more, it can be a very costly affair for young designers shipping press samples to, photo shoots abroad and so on. Amalie, do you as a label have a conscious approach to getting press coverage? Is this something that is important to you?
I mean, of course it is important because it's about sharing my work, my vision, and of course just getting people to see what we do. I think for me it's still kind of new taking this into consideration like as an active thing, because I think as an emerging designer to begin with, it's kind of like, you test out these different things and people are, you're kind of learning as you go. So I think now I kind of reach a point where, we are trying to be more like selective around, okay, what is it we really want to show and emphasize? Because to begin with, it's really, I think it's difficult to have like a strategy around it, because sometimes you feel like you're telling a story, but you feel like what people are picking up is something completely else. And then you really have to learn how to communicate your work. So of course it's a huge part of it, but it's also super interesting getting people down in the studio asking questions, because sometimes you are really like, okay, is that a thing, or is it something people care about because you're just in the studio in your own little bubble
being
of
nerdy.
work? Yeah. So yeah, it of course it means a lot.
the media landscape has changed a lot, not only as a result of SoMe and digital media, but also the stories and that are told and the peoples that get coverage today. It seems to be a more informed fashion media that we see today. But yet, at the core of fashion journalism is news for the sake of news. That kind of dogma. And emerging designers obviously tick that newness box, maybe only as one-day wonders.
Yeah.
How do you approach this newness dogma when you write about new designers? Do you feel a responsibility?
Definitely. I think, as you say, London is a great case study for this,
Yeah.
of this culture of magazines that basically thrive on the hot new thing and sort of thrive on inflating that and then moving on and finding a new one in 6 months' time or whenever new graduate showcases. So I think it's definitely something that is kind of quite front of mind. I don't think it's necessarily something that's entirely avoidable. But I think that for me, it's more about, if I'm writing about a designer, finding out what it is that makes that work actually, intrinsically valuable and why it's a really sort of like powerful proposition creatively, like in a sense that's almost timeless.
Yeah.
Rather than focusing on like, wow, fab, great, new, exciting. It's like, tell me about you're doing like single, like filament knits. Like that's really interesting. Like, what is it that you're doing that actually deserves to be dug into? Like, why do you do what you do? And I think that is my personal way, perhaps, of trying to mediate kind of focusing too much on the sort of like the novelty of a new talent. But I do think it's also quite a broad systemic issue with the speed of the industry and the speed with which we consume imagery that naturally sort of like breeds this quite, cannibalizing sort of like, culture of newness for the sake of, or news for the sake of news.
So writing journalism that lasts, sort of that kind of longevity that in a sense links the wider trend of sustainability, that the written word can also be sustained in a clever way.
Yeah, and I think that, I think that there are certain collections, for example, that people will remember for a very long time, and I think that often if you read the reviews of those collections from like years back, you can really see what it is that made that a really crystallized, significant moment in time as a sort of creative proposal, and I think that still stands. That relevance is still there, and I think that that's almost what it's better to focus on, the newness.
So one last question. Do you have any advice, Mahoro, for emerging designers who want to get press coverage out of just their own channels? Is there a way to work it?
I think imagery is actually one thing that I would advise young designers to focus on, because I think there are definitely being cases where you'll speak with a young designer, you're really passionate about what they have to say in their work and the concepts that underpin it, and then you see the imagery that's produced and it just doesn't quite translate that or add up to the kind of wealth of what it is that you're trying to say. And in such a sort of like, as we've already discussed, a voracious image-based fashion culture, having an image that kind of communicates what it is that you're about in terms of the composition, the lighting, the model you're casting, all of it, I think is really crucial. And that's also what makes press interested, because you just need good imagery to kind of accompany a piece if you're doing a written piece, for example. So yeah, I think that's something that I think is worth focusing on from my experience.
And I'm sure that's something you're very conscious about already, Amalie.
Very much, yes.
Well, thank you both so much for doing this talk with me, and good luck with your show tomorrow, Amalie.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, all the
And
best.
thanks for watching this talk for Copenhagen Fashion Week.